Welcome, everybody, to our third pre-Purim prep about the Persian Empire. And it's really exciting to complete this series. I'm also letting you know that there is a part four, which is a bit more philosophical, but it's freely available, and I'm adding it both to the members area and also just making it freely available. I'm going to post it. So that's kind of a philosophical wrap up. That's a class that I did for a community in Montreal last year. So it's just publicly available, but that was after these three parts. If you want to go a little bit further, to go to the extra mile. In any event, the return to Zion. Let's explain briefly how we got here, what we're talking about, and get straight into it. So we just had two classes, one each week in the past 2 weeks. The first one was about the Persian Empire, to understand Cyrus the Great through Alexander the Great, to understand basically what's going on, when and where, and something about the Persian Empire, which was a lot of fun. The second class was called In the Days of Ahasuerus, and the second class was more about the Purim story in specific details. So here is the palace of Ahasuerus, here are dishes that were used, and here's fabric and textile, here's images of the guards, and we basically got to understand the story of Purim with the advantage of the archaeology and the places that we can actually visit today. So that was all by way of introduction to the third part, which is the return to Zion, which sort of takes us to the beginning, but also past the story of Purim. So let's understand what we are looking at right now. So the period in history which we call the Persian period is known in Hebrew as Shivat Zion. Shivat Zion is a part of a song. It's part of a psalm which is called Shir HaMa'alot, which is a Tehillim, which is basically about the yearning for returning to Zion, to Jerusalem, to Israel after the destruction of the temple. So Shir HaMa'alot, it's often a song that we sing before benching, before blessing at the end of a meal, and you can sometimes hear it in the tune of Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. Shir HaMa'alot b'shuv Hashem et shivat Zion hayinu kecholmim, or the typical tune by Yossele Rosenblatt. Shir HaMa'alot b'shuv Hashem. So these are famous songs, and so this is where the expression Shivat Zion comes from, because it's basically the fulfilling of a dream of the people who were exiled into Babylon and then under the Persian Empire in Babylon and in Persia. They wanted to come home, and this is their fulfillment of that dream. We finally get to come home. So that's why this is called Shivat Zion, and it's what it's called in general in Israel. It's what we call this period in Jewish history. You'll even see this in the museum. I saw it today, so I can tell you it's actually like that. Okay, so let's continue the story. So Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great defeats the Babylonian Empire and establishes his kingdom, and we spoke a lot about that. And why is there a scaffolding? I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. Yes, there was Esther. You missed the class last week. Yes, it's available in the recordings. Okay. Okay. What was the question? Why is there a what in the background? A scaffolding? This picture. This is the Tower of Babel, because he conquered Babylon. It's an imaginary picture. I'm just responding to the
It's
question in the comment.
the slide before.
What?
Yeah, the slide before.
Oh, it's made with AI, and it's showing the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But I'll get to that. I'll explain that. You'll see that picture. It's an important picture. Even though I made it with AI, there's a reason it's there. So I'm definitely going to explain that. So Cyrus the Great basically makes an announcement that allows all the Jews who are in exile to go back and rebuild the temple. We don't have to go over all of those verses right now. I'm just going to mention that we spoke about them, so we're familiar with them. Okay? Now, this is the timeline, the outline of all of the major kings of the Persian Empire. And the only ones that really matter to us right now are the ones that are listed in pink, because they're the only ones that are mentioned in Tanakh, in the Jewish story. But besides that, the Purim story is happening with Xerxes, Ahasuerus the first, who is the second from the three that are together. Darius the first, Xerxes the first, Artaxerxes, Artaxerxes the first. Now, last week we actually discussed how we know that Xerxes is Achashverosh. We went into the writing, how you pronounce it in ancient Persian as Chayarsha, and why we add an A, because you can't say it without choking. And then the Greeks don't have the letter Sha, so they had to write Ksa, and we read the Ksa as Z. So it's a lot of, you have to sort of follow the history of how you write letters, and we spoke about that last week. The story of Cyrus the Great allowed Jews to go back to Jerusalem and start building. And what happened is that in the middle of that operation, our political enemies said, we don't want the Jews building the temple in Jerusalem. So what they did is they actually sent letters to the Persian Empire telling them that they should stop us. In the background of the story of Purim, while Queen Esther and Mordecai are in Shushan, when we have that whole story, there are tens of thousands of Jews in Israel who can't continue building the temple in Jerusalem because of all kinds of political problems that are being caused by our enemies. So nobody's touching that topic. Nobody wants to talk about it. And in fact, we have a Jewish tradition, we have a medrash that says that when Achashverosh tells Esther, you can ask me for anything up till half of the kingdom, or ad chatzia malchut, he's basically saying you can ask me for anything except that which will split the kingdom in half. In other words, don't talk about Jerusalem because that's going to be a problem. I don't want to deal with things that will cause problems in the kingdom. I want everybody to be happy. So don't bring that up. So in other words, we know it's happening in the background, okay? And then the story that we're going to follow today that continues the building of Jerusalem and the temple is under Artaxerxes, which is the son of Achashverosh. And if it's correct that Esther was the mother of Artaxerxes, then he was technically Jewish, even though he probably didn't celebrate a bar mitzvah. But anyway, Artaxerxes is the story we're going to get into a little bit today. Now let's quickly see this on the map. Here is our map of the Persian Empire, which we've visited before, and it shows the centers of power, the capitals in green stars. We have Babylonia and Shushan, Susa, and Persepolis and Pasargada. Pasargada is basically where Cyrus the Great is buried. So these are the centers of power, and this is where most of the Jews are at this time. And we're going to see soon there's also a Jewish community that's very far away from everything. And we're going to see something that we know from them. You're going to actually read something that they wrote, which is really cool. Just take a close look at the very bottom of the map, the bottom of the map of the Persian Empire. On the Nile River, north of where it says Nubia, there is a city called Elephantine, which is an island which was probably a trading post for elephant tusks from Africa. So we're going to visit there and discover that there was also a Jewish community during the Persian period there, and we can read what they wrote. Like you can read the actual papyrus, which is way cool. And we're going to get to that. Now, the important parts of our story. Let's zoom in. This is a map of the ancient Near East. We see Babylonia and Babylon and Assyria and Persia on the east, and on the west we have Samaria, Jerusalem, Egypt, all that stuff. Now, the story begins with the conquest of Babylon. That's the first class that we did. That's Cyrus the Great. He allows Jews to go to Jerusalem. There are now 40,000 or more Jews in Jerusalem who are busy trying to rebuild, and the building was halted. It was stopped. There's nothing we can do about it. It's waiting. And in the meanwhile, we have the story of Purim that's happening in Shushan. And after that story of Purim, we can go back to Jerusalem and talk about rebuilding it. So that's the background to what's called Shivat Zion. Now let's actually go to Zion. And we are looking at the modern walls of Jerusalem. This is not exactly one of the prettier gates. It's been shut by the same person who built it, Suleiman the Magnificent, just about 500 years ago. Can anybody tell me the name of this gate? Anybody know the name of this gate? Let me give you a hint as to where it is. We're going to move a little bit further out to the Mount of Olives. Har HaZeitim, Mount of Olives, a gigantic ancient Jewish cemetery that is to the east. If anybody knows, feel free to unmute yourselves. What's the name of this gate?
Sha'ar HaRachamim.
That is correct. Sha'ar HaRachamim, the gate of mercy. In English, it's known as the Golden Gate, probably because the sun rises from the east and hits it and it lights up like it's made of gold. So the Golden Gate. The name isn't that important because it's only 500 years old. But here's where it gets interesting. Okay? Here's where it gets interesting. We are looking directly at the Temple Mount. This golden dome is where the temple used to stand. Now, we have Jewish sources that tell us, this is in the Mishnah, for example, that tell us that when the exiles from Babylon came back and rebuilt the temple was built right over here. So let's try to kind of imagine it, I guess. I'm trying here, yeah. Here we go. So there's a temple. And there's a nice gate, entrance to the temple, and all that stuff. And there's the two pillars here. Okay, so we have our temple here. And this was the entrance to the temple. Now, there was a gate in the walls of Jerusalem, not these walls. You have to imagine the walls, because the walls were destroyed by the Romans, and it's different walls. But there was a gate over here. I'll make it in red. There was a gate over here, which was called the Shushan Gate. Sha'ar Shushan, the Shushan Gate. Now, why on earth would we give a gate of Jerusalem the name of the capital of the Persian Empire? That's a weird thing to do. Does anybody have a guess as to why that would be? Why would the Jews who came back to Israel and rebuilt the temples and rebuilt the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, name a gate after the Persian capital? It was called the Shushan Gate. Why would they do that?
Out of respect for either like Ahasuerus being accommodating or the Purim story?
Absolutely, yes. In order to respect the empire that allowed us to rebuild the temple, to remember how we got here. That's a very important thing. So this was called the Shushan Gate. It no longer stands, so it's not exactly where the Golden Gates were. It was a little bit more to the south. But this is a hallmark of the return to Zion, Shivat Zion. All right. Now let's move on to the next part. So I'd like to show you quickly a few archaeological finds from Israel from the Persian period. You might even be familiar with some of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean you know that they're from the Persian period. So that's a bit of a fun thing. And let's begin with the fake that we all covered. So remember, this is called Shivat Zion. That's the period, and it's related to Purim because it's happening in the background while Purim is going on. So this site, which we visited earlier in the first class, is called Lachish, and there's a nice display of different chairs that the height of the chair is the span of the kings who ruled from Rechavam, the son of King Shlomo Solomon, all the way to the last King Tzidkiyahu, from when the kingdom split into Judah and Israel. And these two little roofed areas on this platform to the right is the Persian layer of the city of Lachish. So we visit the site of Lachish earlier on. The city of Lachish was a very powerful city in the first temple period. It was destroyed by the Assyrians, destroyed by the Babylonians, and eventually rebuilt by the Persians. And right on top here, it's the same angle we were looking at before. Right on top here is a Persian palace, which not much of it was left. All that is left after the excavations is this pillar, or the base of a pillar, and this one. That's pretty much all that's left. Here's another view, and that's all we have left. Now, about 3 years ago, some traveler, some visitor to the site found a piece of pottery, a piece of clay, that had etchings on it in letters that are basically Hebrew letters. They're official Aramaic letters, which we're going to see soon are familiar to us. This is the piece of clay. And the piece of clay has the following writing. We did this earlier, but I'm going to do it with you again for those of you who weren't around. So it says as follows. Here's a shin, here's a nun, and here's a taf. Year, shnat. This is a Persian system. It's a different system for numbering. It's Persian, it's Egyptian. This basically says year 24 in modern numbers. Okay? And then it says Dalid, Resh, with a little chupchik there. That's a Yud, Vav, and another Shin. Dar Yavesh. Year 24, Dar Yavesh. This is kind of cool because year 24, because of all of the three kings whose name was Darius, and they're all highlighted here in pink, only one of them ruled for long enough to have a 24th year, and that's the father of Achashverosh. So something from the Persian period in Israel, that is way cool. And if you'll remember, within 3 days we found out it was a fake. Or rather, it was a teacher who was trying to explain how people wrote things on pottery from the Persian period, on the Persian period of the site. She clearly knew what she was doing. She scratched onto the piece of clay, explained it, and then when she finished explaining, she just threw it, and then that visitor found it and announced it. So within 3 days, they found out that it wasn't a fake of the kind that you sell to make money, but it wasn't an original. It was the original piece of clay, but it was just found on the site and she carved on it. So that's a really funny story and kind of an embarrassing one. Now let's talk about the other one. I'd like to take you to a site in Jerusalem that if you're in Israel, you should be familiar with. And if not, you will know it now. And if you come to visit, you'll know you can go and visit there. We are right now right outside the Mamilla Mall, right outside the Old City. Those green dots are the Mount of Olives. Those brown dots are the Jewish Quarter. And we're right outside what's called Liberty Bell Park. We actually have one in Israel with a copy of the Liberty Bell from the United States. It's called Gan HaPa'amon. And here we are. This area is called the First Station. If you're in Jerusalem, you've definitely seen this. It used to be an Ottoman train station. It doesn't exist anymore. It's just it's a cool place, and there's bus stops here, and you can climb up here to this hill. It's a lot of fun. And let's move into the First Station, just so you get an idea of where it is. So this is right outside. And when you continue, like you go down here towards Emek Rephaim, towards Talpiot, that whole area, that's Gan HaPa'amon. And if you go down here, you'll get to the Old City. That's the way up to Zion Gate. And right here is the Begin Center and St. Andrew's Scottish Church. And this area with the stairs and railing and grass, if you walk through it, there's a gate at the end, and when you walk through that gate, you will get to here. Here it is. You get to this site. It's closed at dark, so you got to come here during the day, but it's just open. You can just walk in. This area it's a large area. This is the part that you can see where people were buried in the late First Temple period and the beginning of the Second Temple, the Second Beit HaMikdash period, the Persian period. Now, the story goes like this. On top here, there are kinds of sunken beds where they would lay out bodies to decay, and then they would collect the bones, and they would put them all together like in a family grave. Now, 40 years ago, or to be precise, 42 years ago, 1983, there was an excavation here from Hebrew University, and everything was stolen by robbers. So they thought there's nothing really left to see. And then there was this little kid, an 8-year-old kid, who is now in his 50s or early 60s, but he was an 8-year-old kid, and he climbed down this little hole where there was apparently a burial that wasn't discovered by robbers because the ceiling collapsed and somehow it covered everything, so they didn't find anything. This little kid climbs in and he finds something very unique that is from the Persian period. Now, that thing is described here on the wall, but I'm going to show this to you up close in just a moment, and it tells you the whole story. Those of you who know what this is, wait for it, because there's a lot who don't. So let's go and see where it is today, which is, of course, in the Israel Museum. They copied what the tomb looked like. Here it is, except that black square that you saw earlier, which is where the 8-year-old kid climbed in, was over here. So everything you see is underground. So this isn't really what it looked like. You have to climb in and flashlights and the whole thing, but they want you to get an idea of what it looked like without having to, climb in and hurt yourself. So here it is. Let's move up close. And you'll see that there's a plastic skeleton. This is not a real skeleton. They reburied the old ones. I don't really know what they did with them, but they didn't put them in the museum, of course. And Kohanim have to know this, and there's a reason I'm mentioning Kohanim, because that's what they found here. In addition to all of these treasures that this kid just came out and pulled Gabi Barkai, the archaeologist, by the pants. He said, look what I found, look what I found. And he found this little clay jug or candle like this. There's also arrowheads and treasures that they found here. So they discovered all of this stuff. And then they found these 2 tiny little golden amulets that you would probably wear on you on a necklace. And inside them, they had these 2 tiny little pieces of silver. These really, really tiny things that are so tiny and so delicate that if you would try to open them, they would fall apart. They're so brittle, they would just crumble. So you would never be able to unroll them and read them unless you know how to do it with special temperature controlled rooms, chemicals. I don't even know what they did, but I know that it took them 3 years to unroll these silver amulets. 3 years. That's a lot of patience. So like, no, I want to see what it says. Boom, it crumbles and you never know what it says again. So thank God, 3 years to open this. Now, if you look carefully, you'll see that there's some etching on it, but it's very hard to read. Even if you stand there in the museum, the silver became a little bit black. It got tarnished, and there's a magnifying glass there, and it's still hard to read it. But you can't just clean it because you'll ruin it. Now, they found 2 amulets, and both of them have a blessing. If you go to the museum, you can read the whole text. But basically, within this blessing, it's saying, may God Almighty, who controls this and does this and that, bless you. And then it says, Yevarecha Hashem Yishmerecha, the whole thing. And each one of them has a different blessing of some sort with the reference to those particular people, perhaps their name. And it has 1 or 2 of those verses, those psukim of Birkat Kohanim. Now, the significance of this is that this is the oldest pasuk, the oldest verse from the Torah ever found. We never found an earlier one. This is hundreds of years earlier than what are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, the oldest Torah scrolls or Yeshayahu and others. So this is quite incredible. And they're written in ancient Hebrew, and they're probably from the Persian period. All right. Let me show it to you. First of all, here's the priestly blessing. This is showing it to you. It's fragmented, so whatever we were able to pick out, it was very difficult to put it all together. But you see, it's ancient Hebrew. And some of you know how to read this already, or are familiar. If you've been on tours with me, or if you've been in classes, we discussed this. This is the Hebrew that we used until the beginning of the Persian period. And I spoke about this on the class about the Samaritans. If you were in that class, I spoke about how Ezra, the Jewish leader, had a clash with the Samaritans, and they kept using it, and they still use it until today. We don't use it. We use the Aramaic letters that we're going to learn how to read very soon, like the one on that piece of pottery. That's called Ashurit, those square letters. Okay, so now let's change this to modern letters and see it. Yivarechecha Hashem ve'yishmerecha. This is the blessing that priests, the Kohanim, say. They lift their hands up every day. This is Am Kohen. I also do this. And you bless the community. Ya'er Hashem panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha ve'yasem lecha shalom. So this is basically a blessing that the Kohanim, the priests of the tribe of Levi, give a blessing from God onto the people. Now, the following verse is a really interesting one. And it says, V'samu et shmi al b'nei Yisrael v'ani avarechem. They shall place my name on the people of Israel, and I will bless them. This is what God is saying in the story. Now, what's interesting is that they wore this as an amulet. So it says they shall place my name on the people of Israel. So that's what they did. They wore it on themselves, which is kind of cool. It's like they tried to, that's one way to understand it. Okay, so that's two things from the Persian period. Another really interesting thing from the Persian period, I'm going to show you where this is in the museum, and then we'll get back to the things that we found. Right here, we were just down those stairs. We just climbed up the stairs. This is a small display of things found in Israel. And look at the title up here. Under Persian rule, Tachat Shilton Paras. And then there's a little plaque here that says Return to Zion, Shivat Zion. That's what we call this period. And there's lots of silver dishes like the ones we saw in the British Museum, but these ones were found in Israel. And here's a picture of Achashverosh on his throne and two fragments of a metal throne that we found in Samaria from that time. And now we're going to talk about these tiny little dots that you can barely see. There's some nice pictures here. Now, these things are so small, just so you get an idea. We're talking about these three little things, and there's one tiny one behind a magnifying glass. These are the tiniest coins in the world. It's called a half oboe. It's just the smallest coin of silver. They have bigger ones. They don't have smaller ones. So these are the smallest coins. They were found in Israel, and these are the pictures on them. And I would like to look at them up close. The Israelis here might already recognize some of these pictures, so wait for it. What is this? So, in the Persian period, the name for Israel is in Aramaic, and it's called Yehud. It's called the satrapy, the Pachavata di Yehud. The satrapy, the district, like a township or something like that. It's basically under the rulership of larger governors and then kings and governors and all that stuff. And beneath them, there's a governor who's in charge of Yehud. And we have names of some of these guys. So here's the map. And the map shows us Yehud, which is in red. I'll enlarge it in a moment. And here's a coin that you should recognize if you're Israeli. I have one right over here. That's the 1 shekel coin. I'm just holding it up to the camera, right? So we're going to look at this 1 shekel coin because the money that we use in Israel is just so much fun. When you look at money, it's always a story from archaeology, which is a lot of fun. So let's take a closer look. So here is Judea or Yehud, which is a very small it's a small area in the time of the Persian period. It grows later after Alexander the Great and the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, but it's very small. And to our north are the Samaritans we learned about. So the Samaritans have their own governor, and we saw pieces of the throne of that particular governor. We know some of their names. If you read the book of Nehemiah, his name is Sanballat, and we found something with his name. It's in the Israel Museum. But anyway, that's another story. So the Samaritans are one of our neighbors who are sometimes causing us trouble, and that's the story. Now let's take a look at this coin. To illustrate how tiny this coin is, I'm using this Lego figure. It's smaller than the head on a Lego figure, okay? And if you've ever stepped on this, okay, you know how it feels. So this tiny coin has the picture that we have on our 1 shekel coin. It's basically a flower. It's a lily. On the other side is the writing, which I'll get to in a moment. But first of all, this is the Israeli coin. So now you see that 1 to 1, except the Israeli coin also has the emblem of the state of Israel, and 3 little letters in ancient Hebrew. You can test how well you know your ancient Hebrew by trying to read what it says already. But this is the first coin made in Israel, ever, in history. And it's not made by a Jewish king, it's made by a Jewish governor who is under the control of the Persian Empire in the period known as Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. So that's why we use it on modern Israeli money, because it has a story that relates to the Jews. The other side of the coin depicts a vulture or an eagle, but probably a vulture, which is the symbol of the city of Tyre, Tzol, in Lebanon. They made coins like this as well, and there are 3 letters on the top of his wing to the right of the coin. It's a little hard to see, so let me help you. And it's those 3 letters. What are those 3 letters? Does anybody know? Anybody guess? Yeah, go ahead.
Yahad or Yehud.
Yehud, very good. Without the Vav, it's just Yehud. It's called Yehud. I would just like to show you, I have this book. This is a heavy book, like it's really heavy. It weighs a few pounds. And this is a book that's called The Yehud Coinage, a study and dye classification. It's talking about how you dye them, like the picture that you make on them, of the provincial silver coinage of Judah. So this entire book is all about Yehud coins, and there are hundreds of examples of them throughout this book, special designs, all kinds of different things. It's a lot of fun. Of course, it's a very academic book, but still, just so you know that this is a real thing. Yehud coins is a very big deal, and people know about this in Israel. So this is a Yehud coin. Okay, now let's get back to Shivat Zion, and we're going to start meeting the characters and visiting the sites and learning a little bit more about them. So let's first of all look at this picture. I used AI, of course, to try to make a nice picture that shows Jerusalem in ruins, but a leader trying to help the Jews rebuild it. And AI did a lot of very funny things there. So you could start noticing the funny things. There's a lot of them. I'll point out the most obvious one. There's a microphone. There's also a lot of bound books, which did not exist at this time. People used scrolls, not to mention the way the chair looks. It's kind of backwards. I don't even know how you sit on that chair. And then the walls of Jerusalem are the Ottoman walls, and there's a minaret which belongs to in a mosque, not in early Second Temple Jerusalem. And then everybody is sitting outside what looks like it might be the Kotel. I don't even know. And what are those hats? So yeah, and you might even notice some other things. It's AI. You have to forgive AI, but this is just a lot of fun. Now, who are the leaders of the Jewish people during this period? The leaders of the Jewish people are called Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah are characters who are from Babylon, from the Persian Empire, or from Shushan even, and we're going to meet them soon. We're going to talk about them a little bit and what's unique about each one of them. But now there is another person who we need to meet. His name is Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is an heir to the Davidic dynasty. He's from the family of King David. He's from the family of the king. So he's one of the Jewish leaders, but he's not exactly a leader like Ezra and Nehemiah, but he's from the royal family. But there's no king under the Persian Empire. So he's sort of there as well. And in this picture, he's speaking to the people with the ruins of Jerusalem all around. And you see where AI sort of smeared everybody else by trying to continue the pictures, and it just made a mess. But you get the idea. Jerusalem is in ruins, Israel is in ruins, and now they're coming and they need encouragement to rebuild. Now, I want to refer to a song which you all should know at least the opening tune or verse. It's a song about different periods in Jewish history, and it begins with Ma'oz Tzur. We sing this on Hanukkah. Ma'oz Tzur Yeshuati Lechana El Shabeach. Let's go to the second and the third stanzas, which talk about the Babylonian period and the Persian period, and I just want to mention a couple of things. Where is Zerubbabel mentioned? Ketz Bavel Zerubbabel leketz shiv'im noshati. The end of Bavel, Zerubbabel. So Bavel comes to an end by the Persian Empire, and Zerubbabel is there with us at the end of the Babylonian period, after 70 years of exile, and we come back to Israel. And now the next verse talks about Haman and Mordechai, and it's the Purim story. So I'm going to throw that in here as well. Kerot komat berosh bikesh Agagi ben Hamedata. This Agagi, this Haman, wanted to cut down a tree in order to hang Mordechai, right? So it all backfired. And then he's hung. ראש ימיני נישאת ואויב שמו מחית רוב בניו וקנייניו על העץ תליתה. So the head of the Yemini, Mordechai, was uplifted. He was important, and all of his enemies were destroyed, and most of his children were hung up on a tree, and everything was like, it's the song, it rhymes, it's cute. But now we can put it together. It's the Persian period. All right, Ezra and Nehemiah. Let's get into it. Okay, so Ezra and Nehemiah are two different leaders. In fact, there's the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah are originally one book. It's actually the Christian editors that split them into two. It's really one book, even though they're not written by the same person, but it's Ezra and Nehemiah is really one book. In any event, Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra is basically a religious leader who tries to reinforce the connection of the Jewish people to the Torah, to recommit to it, to do things properly, and not to make the mistakes that led to the destruction of the first temple, by the first Beit HaMikdash. And Nehemiah, while he's also a religious leader, he builds the walls of Jerusalem. Like, that's his grand achievement. That's what most of the book of Nehemiah is about. And it all begins in the city of Shushan. So let's go there. Okay. I'll get to, and by the way, the question as to what Ezra achieved, I'm going to get back to that in a few moments. Okay. I'm going to talk about Ezra. Okay. So, Shushan. So we are now deep in the Persian Empire. We are basically right after the story of Purim. We're with the successor of Ahasuerus, whose name is Artaxerxes, or Artaxerxes, or bless you. You're welcome. So Artaxerxes, this is the palace in Shushan. We visited here before. We talked about it. Here it is. And there is some kind of party going on, and the king has a cupbearer who pours him his wine. And the name of that cupbearer is Nehemiah, son of Chachaliah. And these are the opening verses of Nehemiah. I'm going to just read the first one, but I'm going to kind of tell you the story. I'm just putting the verse here and color coding the different characters and interesting points just so you have an anchor. Divrei Nehemiah ben Chachaliah. So here's what Nehemiah says. Vayhi b'chodesh Kislev. He's using the Babylonian months. We are in exile. The month of Kislev, year 20. 20 of who? We will find out, but it's year 20 of a king. We always count to the years of the king. That's how old dates used to be. Va'ani hayiti b'Shushan habira. And I was in Shushan, the capital. And now he starts telling the story of what he was doing and how he hears news of what's going on in Jerusalem, how everybody went there and they thought Jerusalem's going to be built, but then it was stopped and there's all kinds of political problems, and he is in a position of power now because he is serving the king. So what am I going to do about it? Now, which king is he serving? That's the image on the left, that king who's holding an arch. Who is this king? Let's skip a little bit forward in Nehemiah. Vayhi b'chodesh Nisan, Shnat Esrim la'Artaxerxes hamelech. So we've moved from Kislev, Kislev, Tevet, Shvat, Adar, Nisan. We've moved ahead several months. It's still year 20 to Artaxerxes the king. Yain lefanav. There is wine being poured before him. Va'esai et hayain. Now I carry the wine and give it to the king. V'lo hayiti ra lefanav. And I wasn't bad before him. It's like, not bad. You know what you're doing. You know how to pour wine. You're a good Jew. No, but what's really important here is that he continues to tell the story of how he was sad because of the fact that Jerusalem is still in ruins and the temple is still ruined, even though Cyrus the Great allowed the Jews to build it, but there were technical problems, political problems, enemies, we couldn't build it. Fine. So the king sees that Nehemiah is looking sad. Now here's something you need to understand about the cupbearer. The title cupbearer, Sar HaMashkim, or Rav Shakeh in Aramaic, means that you are you have the ear of the king, you're his right-hand man. You could kill the king if you poison him because he's drinking out of your hands. So the king has to really, really trust you. And if you start looking like there's something going on your mind, you're acting weird, you're acting suspicious, the king might worry that maybe you're trying to poison him and you're afraid, or your feelings are giving away your intentions. So the king asks him, what's going on there, Mr. Nehemiah? It looks like there's something on your mind. And Nehemiah says, listen, your majesty, I heard about the city of my forefathers, which is in ruins and it's desecrated. It's like a big graveyard. Like, I'm so sad. So the king says, okay, that's a good answer. Like, if you would give him a bad answer, he could be killed, right? So that's a good answer. I can understand why you're sad. How can I help? And the king sends Nehemiah with an army to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. And that's what happens in the book of Nehemiah. So there's all these enemies who are trying to stop him, but this time he has an army. So not a big army, but he's got soldiers. Like he's got a punch. He's got power to his punch. He could say, I need this to get done, and it will get done. As opposed to Ezra, who's a spiritual leader, but he can't force people to do anything. Nehemiah can. Okay, we'll get to Ezra in a moment. Now, I want to show you something really cool, which we saw in the second class last week, but now it's going to connect in a whole new level. Remember this drinking cup and that bowl that we saw? It's poured out in a funny way into a bowl. Now, what does it say on the bowl? I'll remind you. On the bowl, there is a text in cuneiform. You can see it. And here's what it says. Artaxerxes, the great king, king of kings, king of the lands, son of Xerxes, the king, which is Achashverosh. Achashverosh, son of Dariavish, the king, the Achamenid. In his house, this silver bowl was made. Now, Nehemiah is using these kinds of bowls in that very place, serving the king wine. I don't know if he touched this bowl, but it's really cool. Like, wow. Like a wink from the past. So this is a hello from the past. This is just great stuff. All right. So this was Nehemiah, and Nehemiah goes and rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, and we'll get back to Nehemiah in the end. Now let's move on to Ezra. So here's another verse, and this is in Ezra, the book of Ezra. A lot of it's written in Aramaic, which was the lingua franca. It's the diplomatic language of all the great empires until the Greeks. The Persians spoke Aramaic, the Babylonians spoke Aramaic, the Assyrians spoke Aramaic. So this is the language. It was like English today. Everybody uses Aramaic. So it says, Artaxerxes melech malchaya. Artaxerxes, the king of kings. Now this is a verse you should know from the Friday night Shabbat song, Shalom Aleichem. However you sing it, Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharet, Malachei Elyon, Mi Melech Malchei Hamlachim. Right? Melech Hamlachim, the king of kings, is a reference to emperors. So when we refer to God as the king of kings, we're basically saying you are a king above the kings of kings. It's words that are borrowed from the book of Daniel, but that's for another time. Okay. Now, Artaxerxes, the king of kings, issues the following announcement to Ezra Kahana. So Ezra is a Kohen, he's a priest. Safar Data, a person who's in charge of the Jewish law. Data, which in modern Hebrew means religion, but that's not what it really means. It just means law. It just means law. It's related to the word data that we use, like information. Now, he's basically saying everybody in my kingdom who wants to make donations, min amai Yisrael v'chahanoi v'leviyayeh, in other words, from everyone from the people of Israel and the Kohanim and the Leviim who want to go to Jerusalem can go with you. In other words, the king saying, I'm supporting this envoy to Jerusalem, Ezra, the Kohanim, Leviim, go. I give you my blessing of the king, and go and rebuild the nation of Israel. So what exactly does Ezra do? Ezra's main achievements are religious achievements. What he basically does is he helps strengthen the connection to the Torah. And he deals with a lot of things. Some of them are very, very uncomfortable. He deals with things like intermarriage. He deals with things like people not committing to the laws of Israel. So he's like, what are we going to do? Let's reconnect people. Let's strengthen it. Let's make a new covenant so that everybody, like they build the temple and then they celebrate Rosh Hashanah, the new year. And people don't know what they're doing and they're crying. And he's like, you're not supposed to cry. You're supposed to be happy. It's Rosh Hashanah. It's a happy day. So he deals a lot with religious life. That's what Ezra is doing. He's compared to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses. He's compared to Moshe in that sense, where we even have some in some sources in the Talmud, in the Gemara, it says that Ezra was worthy of giving the Torah to Israel just like Moshe at Sinai. So he's up there. Sometimes we interchange the two. Moshe and Ezra are very, very similar. Okay, so that's Ezra. Now let's get on to our story. I would like to introduce the Jewish community of Elephantine, and then we have a little bit of a few artifacts from Israel, and then a nice story to end with. Okay, so remember this inscription? We did this in the first class, which shows Darius the Great defeating his enemies, and it's written on this hill up there, the Behistun inscription. It's called because it's on Hill Behistun. And it's written in 3 languages. And it's written in 3 languages because the Persians wrote in many different languages. And thanks to that, we know how to read cuneiform. We spoke about that in the first class, so I'm not going to repeat the details. I'm just going to show you a papyrus. This is a papyrus, which is an Aramaic version of the Behistun inscription story, which means that the Persians wrote in many languages and many scripts. Here's a few other examples. Here is a papyrus in Aramaic from the reign of our king Artaxerxes, or a Greek inscription from the reign of Darius I. So the kings of Persia wrote, as the story in Purim tells us, Medina u'medina kichtava ve'am va'am kilshono. Every nation receives a decree from the king or an edict or information in their language. This was a very big deal in the Persian Empire. Okay. And on that note, I'd like to introduce the elephantine papyri. What am I talking about? Let's first go to elephantine and see where it is, and then we can talk about the rest. The island of Elephantine on the southern border of the Persian Empire. There it is. That's Egypt. We are now on the very top, tippity top of Upper Egypt, or south if you like. But for Egyptians, this was up. Remember, we spoke about this a few weeks ago. This is the High Aswan Dam that was built later. So we're basically on the border of the Persian Empire. And this long island was called Yeb. And right next to it is a place called Son, or Svene. And we'll see those names coming up. But the name that the Greeks called this, or it's known as Elephantine. Why Elephantine? Because this island, which is basically controlling the passageway from further Central Africa to Egypt, was a trading post for elephant tusks, for ivory. And there was a Jewish community during the Persian period that lived on this island. How do we know? Because when we dug here about 100 years ago, we found an archive of letters written in Hebrew and Aramaic from Jews with Jewish names talking about Jewish things. And we're going to read a couple of lines from them together. This is so much fun. So because these are papyrus or papyri that were found in the island of Elephantine, we call them the Elephantine papyri, which is plural for papyrus instead of papyruses. Papyrus is the source of the word paper. It's an ancient kind of paper, but it's made from a plant that's found on the Nile called papyrus. That's where the word comes from. Now, if you want to see this one with your own eyes, go to the Brooklyn Museum on Eastern Parkway. The Brooklyn Museum, you can see it. It's on display. In fact, this is my friend Charles who is trying to read it, and I showed him, as I'm going to show you now, that if you can read basic Hebrew, you could kind of figure out what this says. Let's take a closer look. I'm going to give you some scaffoldings to help you, and then we'll learn about a very cool one. So, there is a month in the Egyptian calendar called the month of Thoth. From Egyptian mythology, it's the god of wisdom. He's also related to the moon. He's an ibis bird. So Thoth is actually pronounced Thoth. In English, we say Thoth. So look carefully. I'm going to show you how to read this together with me, just the first few lines. So each word I'm going to separate. This is that word. That's this word. Can you see that they're the same? Right? Once you see it, it says Yerach, which means moon or month. And here it says Thoth. Just look very carefully and you start seeing it, which is really cool. You could read this. The first time I experienced this, I was in New York and I was reading basically a ktuva, a wedding contract that had the name of Artaxerxes. I almost fell off my feet. Like, oh my God, I can read this. Now, this is a year, so it's not the numbers we're used to, but it's year 4. And here is the name of the king, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes. The samech looks a little different than our samech, but you can make the jump once you've practiced reading it enough times. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I want you to just appreciate that this is when we started using these letters, the modern Hebrew letters, which now look a lot nicer, but this is where we got them in the Persian Empire. Now, there's in blue, I highlighted the name of the place, Son, which is right next to Elephantine. So, year 4 of the king Artaxerxes, the king, we are now here in the fortress of Son, and so says Anani, son of Chagai, son of Meshulam, the Jew, from the flag of Nevudarchi, so that's his family name, to Pachnum, son of Besar, who is an Aramean, here in Son, according to your family, as follows. So it's kind of a legal document. I'm going to give you in your house in the fortress of Son and rent from you such and such amount of grains for this price, and then you'll give it back to me, and blah, 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 and then they have people sign on it. So it's basically a legal document, but it has a Jewish name, Anani bar Chagai bar Meshulam, which is in Aramaic. And if you've ever heard a legal document called a ketubah being read in a wedding, it basically sounds like this. So that's a really neat thing. Now the next one will really blow your mind. And this one I'm not going to read line by line. I'm just going to tell you what it says. It's called the Passover Papyrus from Elephantine, which is it's a reconstruction, because there are several ways to read this, and some say no, that's the wrong way to read it because it's missing a lot of pieces, but this is one of the ways to read it, okay? And it basically is about the Jewish community in Elephantine. Now, these Jews were an army. They were soldiers. They were a garrison, an army of Jews who were serving the Persian Empire, and they had no choice. The Persian Empire sent them to Elephantine. You're guarding the southern border. You're going. So they're there. But they want to be exempt from service on the Passover holiday and not to be forced to eat the army food, which might be chametz, which might be leavened bread, on Pesach. So they explain it. And here's how it goes. So it goes like this. To my brother Yedania and his friends, the Jewish soldier. This is your brother Hananiah speaking. And now this is year 5 to the king Darius. Now, which Darius is a conversation? Is it the first or the second? It can't be the third, because he didn't rule for 5 years. And now I'm sending to the king's messenger, etc., the guy named Arsham, on and on and on. And he's explaining what we're supposed to do and asking for permission. So he's saying what we want to do is to count basically count 14 days from whenever, and the 14th of Nisan, the month of Nisan, in the evening, we want to do the Pesach, and from the 15th till the 21st of Nisan, make the holiday of Matzot for 7 days, and on the 15th and the 21st, not to do any melacha, not to do any work, because it's basically like Shabbat, like the Sabbath, because it's a holiday. So he's going on and on. Then he's saying, listen, not to drink shechar, or not to eat any chametz. So basically, not to drink anything that's like a liquid form of leaven of chametz. Not to eat any chametz, and all these different things, and to get rid of all the chametz and to hide it until after Pesach. So it's like, wow, this is called the Passover Papyrus from the Jews of Elephantine, who are in contact with the king of Persia through the Jews in Jerusalem. It's like there's a lot of this stuff. It's really neat stuff. Okay, now. Let's go to one more site, and then we're going to end with something really, really fun. So we are now going to Jerusalem. And this is what's called the city of David, which you should be familiar with, especially if you've been to Israel. It's the south of the old city today. And in the city of David, we have an area which is called Area G. If you've ever been in an archaeological site, they just list them by letters. So the Royal Quarter, Area G. This area was destroyed in the First Temple period, and then these weird shapes, this is called the stepstone structure, we think was built during the Persian period. That's what we think anyway. But right across the street, they discovered something really cool. And I'll send you the video so you can watch it on your own. There is a parking lot here. See that big canopy? There's a parking lot here. It's no longer a parking lot, of course, but it was called the Givati parking lot. And I want to show you a couple of things that were found there. So here it is. And there's more and more discoveries here all the time. It's always in the news. There's always some really cool new stuff that they find here. So a few years ago, What they found here, right across from the western wall, the Kotel, it's right there, is they found these. This is Yiftach Shalev, Dr. Yiftach Shalev of the Israel Antiquities Authority, holding two stamps, or a stamp and a seal, from the Persian period. Now, the stamp is less interesting for us right now. What's interesting is the seal. So let's take a close look at it. A seal is something that you use to close a document with clay, or you can also do it with wax, and this time they did it with clay. You have a ring with a picture and you sign on it. But the picture that was signed on this piece of clay has a picture of a king sitting on the throne. And to refresh your memory, here is the Persian king sitting on the throne. Now see if you could see the same image in reverse on that stamp. Here, let me help you. See that? This is from the Persian period. So right across the street from the temple, from the time of the Persian kings, we find something sealed by a stamp that has a picture of the king. What does this mean? What does it teach us? It teaches us that in Jerusalem there is an administration. There's like government officials. There's stuff happening. It's a happening place. It's not just some, small backwater city or something like. There's important stuff going on in Jerusalem. That's a very important thing. They also found lots of fish bones, by the way, and the fish bones teach us that the Jews in Jerusalem had access to fish that came from the port. So people were living a good lifestyle. You can't just buy fish in Jerusalem 2,400 years ago because there's no ocean in Jerusalem. You have to get it from the ocean. So there's people there who can afford fish. So that's really neat. Okay, now let's talk about coins, and I'll show you something really cool. So these are coins which don't look like the coins you're familiar with. These are the first coins in the world. The first coins in the world were actually made from a material called electrum, which is where the word electricity comes from. These don't give you an electric shock when you touch them. Electrum simply is an alloy of like 70% silver and 30% gold, or something like that. It's a mixture of gold and silver. It was made in Lydia, which is basically like Turkey. It's like kind of like a Greek invention, and then the Persians started making coins. And the oldest Persian coins made their way to Israel before the Persians conquered Israel. And I want to show you what we did with them, which is funny. So first of all, here is the Persian coins, which are a little nicer than the Lydian coins, but still not that. Sometimes they look the same. Sometimes they're a little bit different. There's a picture of the king striding with an arch and an arrow, just like in this picture. Now, there's a funny name to these coins, and I want to just explain to you what it's called in Hebrew and in English, because I think you'll appreciate this. So these are the earliest coins that are actually mentioned in Tanakh. Remember that shekel means weight measurement. It's like a measurement of silver. It's not an actual coin yet. The oldest coin mentioned, and it's mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah, of course, where else, is the Persian coin called an adarkon, or a derek. Now, derek sounds like a darkon. It could be that it's related to Darius, Darievish, because there's a picture of him on it. But it can also be from the word derech, which in Hebrew means to step. Okay? It's to step. Why? Because of the way that you prepare a bow for shooting. Have you ever seen how bows are prepared for shooting? If they're very long bows, yes, Leora, go ahead.
I did archery for about like 3 years, so I've strung bows a few times.
How do you string a bow?
You bend the bow backwards, and there's like a notch on the top of the bow,
Right.
and you take the string and then you bend it, and you think it's about to break, but it won't.
Right.
And
Now,
sometimes
how
it could get very
exactly do you
difficult.
bend? How do you bend it?
Sometimes you can step on it, but we had a machine that did it
Right.
for
So
us.
you have a machine. Now, 2,400 years ago, they didn't have a machine. You'd have to step on it. And the word for stepping is lidroch, to step. So in modern Hebrew, when you load your weapon, you go like, we say lidroch et haneshek. But the word daruch in Hebrew means like I'm attentive, apprehensive, I'm ready to pounce. Ani daruch. But the word has no meaning. It comes from the ancient word for stringing a bow, which is to step on it. And that word today means to be ready and prepared. So that's a really, really cool thing. And I'm just going to quickly show you that there's 2 verses for those who are interested. So in this book of Ezra, it mentions the people, this continues the story earlier where the king said, you can bring donations to Jerusalem, and it lists the donations in gold and silver. It says there's basically 60,000 golden darkimonim, and then 5,000 amounts of silver, manas of silver. Fine. And then in Ezra, it also mentions lots of gold, a darkonim. So a darkon is the oldest coin mentioned in the Torah. Now look at this. This is so much fun. And I'll tell you a joke somebody told me in the last class. I just didn't even think of it. In a recent discovery, this is last year, we found a site from the time of King Chizkiyahu, basically 2,700 years ago, like basically when coins were just getting started. And on the site, we found a weight that says 1 shekel on it. That's that stone on the right. And the way to write 1 shekel is, that's the symbol for shekel, which is basically a purse, and that's 1. This is a very tiny stone. It weighs just a few grams, but that's a shekel stone. And we found half a silver Persian coin. What happened to this coin? Why would somebody cut a coin in half? Now, here's what's really cool. We only started using coins in Israel in the Persian period. We saw those coins. That's what the shekel design is today. But we see a real silver coin that somehow found its way into Israel hundreds of years before coins actually made their way into Israel. So it's too early. Nobody really knows what to do with coins. So why is it chipped in half? So a joke that somebody made was machzita shekel. It's like the half shekel donation to the temple. Oh, they just cut it in half, which is kind of funny. It's really hysterical. But that's because they didn't know what to do with coins. But the coin is made of silver. And silver, you collect in small bits and you weigh it on a scale. So they just chopped it into pieces and used it. That's it. All right. It's time to start wrapping up. I'd like to take us back to Jerusalem and end with a very fun story and message that relates also to modern Israel. The prophets of Shivat Zion, the Nevi'im of Shivat Zion. Who are the Nevi'im of Shivat Zion? The prophets. These are the closing books of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, and these are the closing books of Tanakh, of the Hebrew Bible, and there are 3 important prophets who each one of them has their own book. There's Haggai, there's Zechariah, or Zachariah, or Zach, but it's Zechariah, or Malachi. Those are the 3. They are basically speaking to the Jews of Shivat Zion, of the Persian period, and trying to encourage them and give them strength and hope with all of the problems that are happening in Jerusalem and in Shushan and in Babylon, all that stuff, okay? Now, I would like to tell you a story, but first I'm going to take you back to Israel so you understand how it's connecting. So here's our story of Israel, and I'm going to show you a couple of places. First of all, Jaffa Gate. Okay, here's Jaffa Gate, and in Jaffa Gate, there is an inscription over here that I'm going to show you the picture of really, really shortly. I'm going to start with that, and then I'm going to go on to the story of the menorah. So here's a close-up of the wall. I took this picture right outside Jaffa Gate, and there's an inscription in Hebrew and in Arabic, and I'm going to write it in Hebrew and in English so we can all appreciate what it says. Right after the Six-Day War, the walls of Jerusalem, of course, were in ruins because there was the war with the Jordanians, and it took several years to fix the walls. So look, it says first in Hebrew and then in English. Biyom asara b'tevet hei tavshin lamed hushlam tikun chomot ha'ir. Alta arucha lechomot Yerushalayim. And in English, on the 10th of Tevet 1970, which is 3 years after the Six-Day War, the restoration of the city walls was completed. And now it's quoting from Nehemiah after he completed the walls. Healing had come to the walls of Jerusalem. Alta arucha lechomot Yerushalayim. So there's a beautiful appreciation of history repeating itself when we come back to Israel and we rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, just like Nehemiah did. That was his main achievement. Okay, next, what I'd like to show you is this. We're going to go into the Jewish quarter where I grew up. And this area, which today has 3 different schools playing, they have to alternate their recess times to not, be a mess. That's what it's like when you're not in homeschooling. This is a very important area where Jews used to live until 1948. There was basically this building which was funded partially by the Rothschild family, the rich Rothschild family, whose emblem is right here on the top. Here it is as well. That's the red shield, Rothschild, red shield, Rothschild. So their emblem is here on the top. They basically funded this building, and there was kind of a rotation between Jewish families for like every year or two. They'd have to rotate until, you came to Israel and you need a place to live, so you could live here until you figure it out, right? So Jews lived here. And this is where the Jews were gathered, the Jews of the Jewish quarter were gathered when the old city fell in the hands of the Jordanians at the end of the war. Now, when the Jewish quarter was rebuilt after 1970, they put a quote up here on the wall. It's a little hard to see it just because of this tree. Look carefully. Look really, really closely, and you should be able to see that there is a quote here carved into the stone. I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to tell you what it says here, but it's really amazing. And then we're going to end with the menorah. Okay, so what does it say here? So it says as follows. Here's a picture that I took of slightly blurry just to hide people's identity, but we have an annual B'nai Mitzvah trip that I do for a community in New York, and they come to Israel, and we go to Masada, and we go to the Old City, and we travel, and I always take them here and tell them the following story. When the Jews came back from Babylon, things were very difficult in Israel. It's not like today where you can get on a bus and go anywhere and there's paved roads and you can get your lovely iced coffee everywhere and shop in Manila and have internet. It was hard. It was really, really hard. And people were giving up and they didn't know what to do. And we're not only talking about modern times when people started coming to Israel 100, 200 years ago. We're also talking about the Persian period, Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. Things were much better in Babylon and in Shushan. People came to Israel. Everything's destroyed. Enemies are trying to defeat us. It's a horrible situation. What are we supposed to do? And Zechariah gives people the following prophecy, the following message. And that's what's carved into the stone. And I'm going to read it in Hebrew and then explain it in English. Ko amar Hashem tzvakot. This is what God is saying. Od yeshvu zekinim uzkenot birchovot Yerushalayim. There will come a time when old men and women will be sitting in the streets of Jerusalem. Ve'ish mishanto biado merov yamim. And people will be leaning on their walking canes because they are so old. Urchovot ha'ir yimal'u yiladim ve'iladot mesachakim berchovotea. The streets of the city will be filled with boys and girls playing in the streets. Just keep on going. It's going to happen. You just wait. This place is going to be filled with children, boys and girls playing, and old men and women because they're going to have security, and it's going to be great. Just keep on going. Okay? And with this, I'm going to end with one last surprise, which is the Menorah Park, a menorah which was given to Israel by the British government after the state of Israel. It's a beautiful menorah right outside the Israeli government, the Knesset, right there. And you get up close to it, and it's got all these images on top of it. And I'm going to show them to you up close because I was actually just recently there. So here's the menorah garden, and there's a plaque that explains it. And basically, along the branches of the menorah are dozens of scenes of stories from Jewish history, from ancient times to modern times. The destruction of the temple here looks like it might be King David, people crying over the destruction of Jerusalem, lots of other stories. And this is the Holocaust in the center. There's like Jewish fighters and destruction and all that. I think that's what that is. And then there's the verse that is actually listed on it. Let me see if we can see it. There's the story of the menorah. So there's a verse that is listed on it on the bottom branch. It says, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'choach ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvakot. I would like to end with this story and tell you what is the significance of the menorah. Okay, so I'm going to end with this story, which is from Zechariah. So, Zechariah, who is one of these three prophets speaking to the Jews in this period, has this vision. We actually read this in the Haftorah on the Shabbat of Hanukkah, so it's a famous story. And this is my AI reconstruction, of course. Zechariah has a vision in which he's being woken up by this angel, and he sees this vision of a menorah, a golden menorah that's lit up with oil that's coming out of two olive branches, olive trees, one on each side. And it's kind of a funny story because he seems to not know what any of this means. So the verses say as follows. I'm just going to quickly paraphrase them. This angel who's speaking in me wakes me up like waking somebody up from a sleep, and he says, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see a golden menorah. It's entirely gold, and it has this stone on top, and there are these 7 candles on top of it. All of these 7s, they're all connected. And there's 2 olives standing, one on the right and one on the left. Olive is in olive trees." And then I spoke to the angel and I said, "So what is this, sir?" And he says, "Don't you know what this is?" And I said, "No, sir, I have no idea what this means." So he says to me, "This is what God's message is to Zerubbabel, saying as follows," and I'll explain this in English. This is what it says on the menorah, by the way. Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach. You don't need an army and you don't need physical strength. Ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvakot. You just need my spirit, my ruach. I will help you. You're gonna make it. It's gonna work. Mi atahar hagadol lifnei Zerubbabel lemisho. Who's that big mountain standing as an obstacle in front of Zerubbabel? I will flatten it and everything's going to work out great. This symbol becomes the symbol of the state of Israel. The menorah, which was from the Arch of Titus, but the menorah of gold surrounded by 2 olives. This is not the Olympic wreath of the Greeks. This is the 2 olives of Zechariah, which mean lo b'chayil v'lo b'choach. It's the menorah as a symbol of endurance and success through spirit and hope. And that is why the return to Zion became such a symbol for the return to Zion again just a few years ago, basically, which is like yesterday in history. And here we are today. So thank you so much for joining 3 pre-Purim preparation episodes, and I hope this has contributed a lot to your appreciation of the period. And I recommend watching the 4th part, but that's really up to you. But I'm going to wish you a happy Purim and Shabbat Shalom. Good night, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.